and greetings to Old Westbury as well. My name is Patrick Love. I'm the Vice President for Student Affairs. And I'm going to introduce our speakers, but I want to thank Fran Glazer. She and I had conversations about some of the needs that we have on campus, and I was able to, through my connection with my colleagues here from NYU, who I worked with both of these gentlemen, Tom Grace and Craig Jolly, when I was on the faculty at NYU. And so Tom and I taught in the same program, and I worked closely with the Division of Student Affairs there. So I'm very pleased that they were able to take the time and come here to talk about this important topic. But I want to thank Fran for the partnership that we've developed, and I look forward to continuing to work with Fran and our other academic colleagues because it's so vitally important that we in Student Affairs work together with our colleagues and on the academic side of the house to best meet the needs of students and to meet the needs of our faculty colleagues who see our students every day in the classroom and recognize that there are many challenges our students are facing and that our faculty colleagues are the ones who see them every day and experience those. And so whatever we can do to support your work, we will do, whether it's something like this or whether it's outside the classroom. In any way that we can support and assist, we want to do that. So I do want to thank Tom and Craig for coming. It's surprising to me that they focused on this topic because there are no disruptive students at NYU as far as I recall. So they must have looked at other institutions. So, but without further ado, let me turn it over to them and thank them again. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Okay. So for those of you out in Long Island, unfortunately, I tend to walk around. And for those of you in the back, I know you think you've escaped, but I walk the aisle and I call on people, so I will be doing that. A little bit about our backgrounds very quickly. Again, as the slide says, I'm at NYU, the director of the Office of Community Standards and Compliance. I'm also a faculty member. I was previously at NYU. I teach in the graduate program in counseling at Montclair State University. It leads to licensure in New Jersey as counselors. Craig is an attorney.
Yes, but I don't advertise that, so I try not to advertise that. So my name's Craig, and I've been at NYU for a number of years, but I spent the first 15 years at NYU in student affairs and housing and residence life and student conduct. And then more recently, I transitioned into our Office of Equal Opportunity. So for the most part, I deal with employment situations, but we're finding ourselves now also weighing in on a number of student situations that involve students with emotional or psychological disabilities, and Tom and I end up collaborating on a lot of those cases still.
Because our offices do have to partner in those. So,
and we're on the same floor, so we're in each other's office all the time.
So what I want to do is to say essentially to you, here we go.
There we go.
Now we've all been there. Now maybe not quite that bad. Some of you have had, hopefully no experiences with students fighting, throwing things. Hopefully it's been a little more subdued than that. We've actually had cases. I once worked with a case where a student in an arts class picked up a 2x4 and started swinging it. We've had a couple of other cases. There actually have been outbursts of violence. But of course, those don't happen very often. But yet, so what I wanted to be able to do is, hopefully none of you have had that, but I'll bet you've had some of these. Let me find out. Distracting behavior. Anybody have a class where students come in late?
There's one.
No, that can't happen here. They're surfing on their cell phone. They're just talking. They're not really listening to every word that we as faculty say, which of course is annoying. And but so I think those students are things we may find irritating. I don't know if they're disruptive, but to us, perhaps it's hard. I mean, I've literally stopped class and I have gone back and said, okay, when you're done with the conversation, we'll continue. So I've actually had to do that. For some reason, that's a personal thing for me. Disruptive behavior. We have some students who can be challenging. Students, again, they're engaging in some kind of behavior, they're arguing, something that it's kind of like I can't keep going on with the class. This really is disrupting the process in much more an overt way than the distracting student. Then, how many of you have had this student? That student in class, something's not right. You're worried about them. It's in their writing or something. So, and what do you do when you've got a student like that? You don't quite know how to respond to that. Some of us, hopefully none of you in this room, have had an overtly hostile student. You know, a student whose behavior literally is argumentative, the person is very loud, so forth and so on. And lastly, and this is the category that I think we all fear, is to have someone in our class that we're worried that they're going to do something. That for something they're sending signals that are starting to scare us. They might be dangerous. And again, it's not something that, you know, most of us ever will encounter, yet it is something that obviously some of our colleagues around universities around the U.S. and the world have encountered. All right, so what I'd like you to do, we're going to just take a little bit of a journey here. Some of the students that I've met, and I think some of you have probably also met, we're going to sort of work our way through to severity. And as we think about what some of those students might be. So if we can start. The inattentive student. Now again, is this really, really distracting? Is this really disrupting, you know, if a student is sleeping? How many of you, if a student puts his head down and says, I'm out of here, that you would find that really very difficult to go on teaching? Just, okay, a couple, okay, fair enough, yeah. So what's distracting to me may be different than the rest of us are like, well, whatever, I can put up with it. So what we do with inattentive students, again, those are the students we were talking about later. I have this thing about surfing, I have a thing about texting and cell phones, and it is amazing to me. And I teach graduate school, and it always amazes to me how many graduate students take their phones out and want to text during class. And I have a very strict policy, no texting. And yet I can still see them under the desk trying to sneak it, you know. So you know they're doing that. So some of us, again, it may not be that we can't engage them. We try, we just can't get them there, you know. So they're distracting. So several of us have met these folks, right? All right. The next type of student, the grade-obsessed student. Not here, of course.
Laughter there.
Yeah, but the grade-obsessed student, and I'm going to go right on down to the last sentence, that, again, I had this happen this summer. I had a student walk up and go, I just got my test back last week, and I didn't get, it was like an A-. Absolutely, and just was insistent, I want to know why it wasn't an A, and I want to talk about it right now. I'm like, could I set my computer up? And I finally had to sort of cool her down and talk a little bit about, I'll see you after class. But this student was so obsessed with grade, and I finally talked with her a little bit, and I found, you know, to her, the grade was her. She was so integrated her identity with the grade that when I gave her a B, I was telling her she was a B person. And that was really hard for her because she was so used to really figuring out who she was vis-a-vis her grades. So a few of you have had this student in your class.
Can I just add, and also there's also, I'm sure, I don't know if some of you experience this, we see this at NYU though, there's a counterpart to the grade-obsessed student, and it's the grade-obsessed parent. That is the one that will call you and advocate and have a hard time understanding how her 4.0 daughter could have gotten a B in this class. They've gotten 4 points in everything, and they don't understand how they got a B in this class. And I talked to the parent, and I think, well, I figured out why they got 4 points in everything, because the parent bullies their way into the A. So this, that's the counterpart, it's the grade-obsessed parent. So.
The narcissistic student. Time magazine called it the me, me, me generation. And this is the student who basically feels as though the class is about me, I'm special. And again, this also goes to the parent kinds of a thing. But, and again, whether you believe this or not, how many of you read and studied or thought about millennial students? Some of you, okay, yeah. So you know this is kind of part of that for some students there's this notion of we've raised a generation of kids, and I guess it's our fault for those of you that have kids who are millennials, that are so used to getting the trophies for trying. If I just show up, where's my trophy? And we've created this notion that everyone's special, and there's no winners and losers. And in certain ways, that's good. And in other ways, though, that creates this illusion, if you will, that is being played out. Now, the narcissistic student, we have, again, some of you may have experienced this, but frequently they will come up and they will say, I pay your salary. Or they'll, who are you to grade me, kind of a thing. We'll challenge your credentials. Because again, for them, it's about them. And again, it's a student that we find infuriating. Now, can you continue teaching? Sure. You know, is this really going to stop class dead in its tracks? Probably not. But it's a frustrating student more than anything else.
And high maintenance, very time.
Very-
This is a very time-consuming student because they want to command your attention. When they email you, they expect a response within 5 minutes, you know, or they want access to you 24/7. So they're high maintenance and very time-consuming.
I had a student that sent me an email on a Saturday 2 weeks ago and says, "I demand you get back to me immediately." It was a Saturday. Now, I know I'm probably the only one who wouldn't have done that in this room. But I was just kind of sneaking on my email, and I really wasn't going to get back because I didn't want to reinforce that. You know, that, yeah, just Friday night, Saturday morning, whatever, email me and I'll get back. But the demand that I'll get back to you immediately. The concerning student. Now, this is the one that I think we do start worrying about a little bit more. All the other students I've been talking about before, irritating, a little annoying, you know, yeah, sometimes it's a bit. Now we get into where I don't know what's going on with this person. So I think there's two types. One is the withdrawn student, that student that you see as isolated, that you're not really able to, they're not connecting. And in their writing, there's things like loneliness, themes like that that's coming out. And, you know, and they just don't seem to be there. And we worry about them. So they're concerning to us sort of because of the social isolation that we see. And then you have others that are more outrageous. This actually is one of our former students. Anybody know who this is? It's Lady Gaga. Yeah, she's an NYU student. A little more subdued when she was in NYU, but nevertheless. You know, we do have some students who, by virtue of their behavior, they show up, they just seem weird. I mean, what's the deal with the pine cone on your head? I assume she wouldn't have worn that to class. But we do have students who, they show up by virtue of their dress, by virtue of things that they say. Again, I actually remember reading something, and I think it might have been the Chronicle, where a faculty member said that you can judge the rigor of the class by the number of baseball hats being worn. And that is, and the derivative of that is if worn forward or backwards. That the more baseball caps worn backwards, it's probably a less challenging class. I don't know if that's true, but I remember reading an article about that. But we do have these students who might, you know, present a little bit differently. How many of you remember Virginia Tech? Do you remember reading about how that student began to appear in class? Sunglasses, hooded sweatshirt, wouldn't take it off, wouldn't participate. So we do see those kinds of things, and you kind of wonder what's, you know, what possibly is going on. Oppositional students, all right? If you say up, they say down. That, you know, again, they want to engage you. Whether it's, you know, just being oppositional for the sake of doing that, but they want to argue everything. What do you mean? This is too many assignments. 2 tests? No. You know, you can't have 3 tests. That's not fair. I don't agree with the grading rubric. I don't think we should do this. I don't think we should do that. And so to that extent, we do occasionally have argumentative students. Now the problem with the argumentative students is this often happens during class. When you're starting to announce, let's talk about the paper that's due, let's talk about the test coming up. They want to engage in an argument. They want to almost be oppositional, like as though they can negotiate their way through it. And have any of you had that experience during a class? A student has actually tried to sort of take you on, if you will, to disagree with what you want to do. And it's kind of alarming because you want to hear the student. On the other hand, you can't just stop and let's renegotiate the entire syllabus. So that's a student.
We encountered a student a couple of years ago that, you know, with access to information online, would like to fact check the professor on her iPad. And incredibly disruptive to class because every time the professor would try to deliver information, the student would be on there with, you know, fact checking it and then, you know, trying to oppose and challenge. Well, according to Wikipedia or whatever blog I'm on right now, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And that was very challenging and disruptive.
The litigious
I
student.
love this one. This is my favorite one.
Well, as an attorney, of course. But the litigious student is the one that essentially not only challenges but threatens. But not threaten you physically. But they tend to look for offenses. They tend to look for feelings where they're not being treated fairly, being slighted. Something wasn't fair. And so they report everything to the department chair. They file complaints. You know, and again, not that they don't have the right to do that, but occasionally you might have a student who has a very, very set of what I expect from you, almost a contractual sense. Now, the contract is based on what they think a faculty member ought to do. I once worked with a case a few years ago where a student's advisor had told the student something. You know, they were just having a chat. And the student took that as, what should happen, and then began to hold the department accountable for it because my advisor said something. But my favorite has nothing to do with academics. Many, many years ago, I was working at a university in Cleveland, at Case Western, some of you may have heard of. And I had a student who called, and parents demanded a single room for their son, who was an engineering major, because all engineering majors must have a single room, right? It's the law. And he said, I was promised a single room. Promised a single room. I thought, really? There's not that many singles. Who promised you? We were here visiting the campus, and we were walking across the campus, and we stopped a student and asked, and he said, oh, all engineering students get single rooms. So that was the standard to which the student was, saying, and if I don't get one, I'm going to sue and all that. So I've been sued several times. My favorite is when I get sued and I see the words pro se. Because as soon as I see that, I realize it's probably going to be something we can deal with. But it is a fact of life in my work that occasionally that does happen. The volatile student. Now we're starting to get into the student who's a little bit more scary. The student who's angry and seems to react. And I'm going to tell you, I'm seeing more of this. I'm getting 1 or 2 or 3 of these a semester now. I don't remember getting that before. And what we're getting is students who engage other students in class during presentations in particularly. I've had several reports of that. One student will be presenting, and there's always some person in the back who's like being harsh, oh, that's just stupid. Where'd you get those numbers? Being very almost verbally abusive during the presentation. And that's relatively new to me, but I'm getting more of those every year. So there's students out there who are very provocative, if you will, and they seem to want to engage. They seem to want to create this sort of alarming situation in class where they take people on. Then, of course, they're taking it outside of class on Facebook. And then that's continuing on. And so what's happening is, while the student may not be overtly threatening people, if you're doing a presentation, someone is calling you names and saying it's stupid, you don't want to continue. And so it's creating an environment in the classroom where students are coming in demanding Johnny be kicked out of class because he was abusive and mean to me when we had our class presentation. Would you kick him out? So Johnny was mean. He was rude. This is stupid. I can't believe this is what terrible work. Really mocking the person when they're doing a class presentation. Absolutely true case. A faculty member called me and said, he's got to get out. I want him out because he's rude to other students. We throwing him out? Oh, depends. Come on. They're disrupting my class. I can't have presentations. You're telling me depends. I'm going to get another answer. Who's kicking him out? You're kicking him out? So you're just going to call him and say you're out of here?
No, I wouldn't call him and say you're out of there. I would send him to the appropriate department to deal with it.
Okay, right?
I can't return to my class until it's taken care of.
Okay, and you have the authority to do that then as a faculty member?
Well, I'm assuming there's other students to think about as well. He's not the only one.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're going to get to all these points in a second. I mean, can you or not? I don't know. You may very well be able to do it. Who else was kicking him out? You were kick. Okay, so you take him aside and talk with him, right? Yeah, which makes sense. And see if his behavior, continues. Yeah. In fact, that was my advice of the case. This is about a month ago. It was the first week of school. Same thing. It's like, take him aside and tell him what he's doing. Kind of a thing. So I'm getting more of those, so we want to talk about all these, and we're leading up to the big ones. We're leading up to the more serious ones. But I want to talk about these simply because these are the kinds of sort of daily, weekly challenging students that can show up in our classrooms. And some of you, has anybody out there said, I've never had one of those? All right, so unless you're just being, whatever. So we're all agreeing one of those students has been in our classroom, and we found it challenging. We found it something we had to figure out, what are we going to do when we've got a student like that I don't quite know how to manage that case. So we have sort of 10 things we'd like to talk about that we think are suggestions for managing these students before we get on to the big ones. One is know the code.
Right. So, most schools, pretty much all schools, have a code of conduct, right, which defines this is what appropriate, this is what appropriate behavior is, this is what is not. When you violate the code, there's usually a process by which a student gets a fair shake at the disciplinary process, right? So it's good to know what actually violates rules. Now, as I was listening here to Tom talk, a lot of what he was describing isn't going to violate a rule, right? I mean,
No, wait, no, you're wrong. She's kicking him out.
Well,
No, I'm sorry, it depends. You're kicking him out.
Yeah.
Did he break a rule? You're still thinking. Have you reached a decision yet? I told you I was going to walk the aisle, right?
Well, I've had students like this, and when they're argumentative with me, I'll ignore it, and as soon as they attack another student, they're out.
You got to deal with it. You're out. Okay. So you've got a quicker hook. You're more compassionate. We're going to chat first. Give him a chance, and you're going to wait and see what the behavior is. I can deal with it, but not another student.
Well,
right?
and a lot of these things, though, that especially when you're dealing with young adults, I don't know if discipline is the best route to go, right? It's a student who is learning social skills, learning how to interact with others, and actually learning how to argue and debate and make scholarly sort of arguments with their colleagues, but they don't know how to do that right away. So just because somebody's disruptive or attacking, it's probably because they haven't developed the skills yet, right? And by the time they're graduating, they've developed those skills. But I don't know that discipline is always the right way, but it's good for you to know, okay, when do they reach that point where we need to talk about making this a disciplinary matter? And it's not what do I have to put up with until it reaches a certain point, but knowing what the rules are can put it on the radar for you of okay, this person's coming close to violating rules, and we may need to start looking at this through a disciplinary lens.
Exactly. And we live in the world of depends. Absolutely. That's our world. Yeah.
And I guess it depends on how you define disciplinary.
No.
Yeah.
Because number 3 is the key to me, being proactive, setting expectations. But if something happens that we hadn't discussed, me saying, okay, time out, Craig, you're going to need to leave, come back and talk to me either before next class or whatever. That's a disciplinary move without it being part of the formal conduct process. I'm sending a strong message of what will be accepted and not accepted, with the idea that, if they then come back, we talk about it and they get back into the class as opposed to being permanently.
But let me piggyback on that. All right. So well played, absolutely. That you took him aside and explained to him, but he did it in your class last year, and he did it in your class the semester before, in your class 2 years ago. He's getting 80. How many warnings do you get? Is it 9 or 10? And that's the challenge. So the strategy makes perfect sense, but that's part of being a system as opposed to each person kind of freelancing how we're going to deal. One story, and this is an absolutely true story. So I'm a doctoral student, and I'm a TA, and I'm full of vim and vinegar, and I'm thinking I'm doing all kinds of fancy stuff. And one of the students in my class comes up and says, where's my paper? And, in those days, actually, that was some time ago, but there were computers, there really were. And he said, where's my paper? I said, I didn't get a paper from you. Oh, I did too. I handed that paper in. You lost I can't believe it was my best paper I ever wrote. I mean, I had this whole thing. I can't, oh man, I said, that's right, give me a copy, no problem. He goes, I didn't make a copy. My printer broke, the dog ate Mars, whatever, and I don't have a copy. And I said, oh, great, no. And so this is not right. I can't believe you lost my paper. It just really gave me a hard time. So we had to work out some compromise, and I don't remember what it was. I counted his test twice or something and gave him 20 extra points. I can't remember. I felt so horrible about losing his paper. And absolutely true, following semester, talking with a faculty member, and the faculty member saying to me, you know what happened to me? God, I lost a paper. I've never had that happen before. And I thought, wait a minute. And, so like, FERPA be damned. I was like, who did you lose the paper for? She goes, well, and she mentioned the name, same guy. So now when I get papers, I make them sign that I got a paper from you. So I know I'm getting it. And again, that was just an early learning experience for me. I never thought someone would do that. But this guy was working his way through school doing that. Getting to know your colleagues in student affairs, and here's why. One of the things that I found myself doing all the time is call me. We'll take it for you. We can't always do it for you. It depends on your code. It depends on who has the authority to discipline a student. And I'm a real advocate of if it can be resolved at the classroom level, let it be resolved. But I'm also an advocate of letting my chair know that this happened, just in case the same person says you lost my paper last semester. but also just in case the student is not the first time they've done that. Think about that. How many times do I get to plagiarize a paper? If we don't talk to each other, I can do it in how many classes throughout my college career? So I think that getting to know the colleagues, we can advise you, we can help you, but one of the things we also can do possibly is, in my office, we have a university-wide database, and we are trying to get faculty to use it. A little bit of a struggle, they're a little bit resistant to doing it, I will admit, but it's something that at least would allow us to kind of know. Again, as Patrick said, being proactive, let them know what you expect. Put it on your syllabus. One of the challenges, I think for a lot of students is when we're vague and when we're not, as explicit with them as we could, is that it opens up for arguments, it opens up for a variety of issues. Respond. I think a lot of us think, well, if I don't say anything, it'll go away. And that occasionally can happen. When's the last time you were something was going on in your life and you said, if I just don't deal with it, it'll go away? They go away, don't they? Yeah, they just disappear. Well, the truth of the matter is, with the exception of dirty dishes in the sink, chances are that student may not go away. And so I really feel for two reasons, and all the reasons I've been saying, not only is it important, it's important to respond because, as Craig said, we might have a kid who's 18 years old and doesn't know better. We might have a student who is from another country, is an international student here, who might have gone through a system with some different standards for what's plagiarism, what isn't, what's allowable in group work, what isn't. We may have someone who, for whatever reason, was engaging in the behavior. So I think responding because of the student to help them be successful is important. Maintaining standards that's fair to everyone, that's equally important. But I think if you don't respond, it's very likely just going to continue. But I know our tendency is to say, well, I'll just let it go. But in responding, there's different levels of behavior. If a kid is surfing, I don't think you need to report him to the dean. Maybe there's other ways to handle that. So I think knowing at your own university what the policies are, what the procedures are, what the processes are, and follow them. But I would urge you to absolutely respond. Now, one of the things that I would really urge you to do, and it's one of my other favorite stories, don't confront a student in class. I know this sounds silly, but I'm wearing this mic, and I was telling Craig, last year I had a situation where a very grade obsessed student went to a professor before class to have a fight over the grade he had just gotten in the last class. Absolutely true story. And it was a big lecture hall, about 300 people. And the students started yelling at the professor, I can't believe you gave me a B, or whatever it was, and began arguing every point. And the professor was saying, look, can we deal with this after class? Come to my office. No, this is not fair. The student started raising his voice. The professor finally said, let's take it out in the hall. The appropriate thing, right? The professor was wearing a mic. He went out in the hallway and had a big argument with the student when the entire class was like applauding. Because, so that's one of the things. Turn your mic off if you take it outside. But when you sit with the student, we always encourage, because if you're doing this, obviously, and the student will try, I'm not saying you would do it, but a lot of students will want to have that discussion in class before or after. But I think it's so important to get the student in a quiet place where they're not, surrounded by others, where you explain the behavior. This is what the concerns are. Maybe the student has a reason that they're doing it. Explain to them what the expectations are. There's resources if they're not sure how to do that. We can get you some help. Again, if you do this again, this is what will happen. We don't want that to happen, right? Our goal here, I often say to students, my goal is to never see you again. Because if you're in my office, you're probably in trouble. And I don't want to see you again for that reason. Graduation, I'll shake your hand, that's great. But how do we keep you out of my office? And I think that's an important goal. And then, that's fine, and to do that. Again, neither over or under responding. When somebody's challenging you, it's pretty easy to get upset, especially if someone is challenging your credentials or whatever. But I think, and it may seem really, really obvious, but again, don't over-respond, but don't under-respond if a student is expressing some concerns. And I tell you the story of the student this summer who wanted to argue the A-A. And until I asked, I didn't realize how important it was. And it went back to parents and all kinds of stuff. And there was so much packed into that A- versus A. I didn't know. I was, what are you, crazy? An A, who cares? She really did. and it really mattered to her. And so I was a little bit too dismissive until we were able to explore it a little bit. So it's something I think we have to think about. Don't get pulled into a debate. Students occasionally will want to engage you in why this is a policy. This is a stupid policy. You know, whatever it is, you know, whether it's an academic integrity policy, whether it's where does it say I can't eat a sandwich in class? Where does it say that? You know, maybe it does somewhere. You know, where does it say I can't do this or can't do that? And they'll want you to defend the policy. And that's awfully tough with some students because they want to debate the policy. In my world, it's pot. Well, pot ought to be legal. So I can't believe I'm in trouble for smoking pot. I mean, everyone knows pot ought to be. Look at Colorado and Montana, blah, blah, blah. And I have to calmly explain, but it isn't in New York. And yet I have some students who want to argue that with me as though I can change that. Craig talked about parents.
Oh, you're going back on that. Sorry.
We know that this is, how many of you have ever gotten a call from a parent complaining about something that their son or daughter had in your class? So a few of you have, 3 or 4 of you have. There's one that's a phenomena that, you know, I don't know if it's increasing over the past few years or not. I suspect it is. But what I will tell you it is increasing. Career development officers are actually finding out that students who are in jobs, their parents are calling their employers to complain about why didn't, true, absolutely true, that they're calling employers and saying, my son just started working for you and I'm really upset about the way he's being treated. And we're seeing more and more of that. So I know at NYU they're telling the students, don't have your mom call your new boss and yell. Which sort of seems, it's like clean up your Facebook is the other one, but you know, but think about that. How many of your parents would have called, how many of your parents are going to call the president, you know, and say, I don't like the way my son or daughter is being treated? Hope no one raised their hand, I appreciate that. But parents will want to engage you. We all know about FERPA, right? You can't really have those discussions. We also know that, you know, so one of the other things that we really try to say is we want to work with the student, not the parent. And we think it's awfully important that we're able to do that. And last but not least, and let me tell you another story. I got a lot of stories. Department had a particularly challenging student. Anyone who ever met that student would agree. Very challenging, difficult student. He was actually a combination of the litigious and probably almost hostile, but very argumentative and very, very difficult, argued everything. And filed grievances and appeals about in fact, one semester took 5 classes, filed grade appeals in 4 out of 5. I think he got an A and didn't appeal that one. So very, very challenging student. So he was going through some process, and the advisor sent an email to a faculty member, and the faculty member actually wrote this scathing, I'm sick of this guy, he's just blasted, saying, you know, we waste our time, he's no good student anyway, he's terrible, blah, 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 and then hit reply all. Yeah, student got it. So, you know, I can absolutely appreciate the frustration, but it's a little bit of sort of going along with turn your mic off if you go outside. You know, I don't know if any of us in this room have ever mistakenly hit reply all. I know I have. So yeah, and it's something just to think about. But yeah.
You know, I think that's an important point that a lot of us don't think about in the age of email. Is that, you know, when we send an email, even if we think it's a candid email between colleagues, in the most technical application of FERPA, if I'm discussing a student, that's an educational record. Even though I think it was an email between me and a colleague, that's an educational record. The student could make a request and want to see any emails that have been written about me by any of my faculty members. If it does become litigious and there's a lawsuit that follows in discovery, they're going to want to see every email that's ever been written. And so all of this would come out. So it's just one of those things of I fire off emails all the time, and always keep that scope of like, am I writing anything here that I would maybe later not want the student to see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The advice that I received that I really liked was, how would I feel having this read aloud in court 3 years from now? How would it sound there? So,
Yeah.
And for those of you that are listening and they couldn't hear, Patrick said that his rule of thumb is advice he's received is never write anything that you would not want to be read in court 3 years later, aloud.
Yeah. And
That's
we've
a
all
good
been
point.
there. Can anyone in this room say you've never written an email you'd like to take back? Today. Yeah.
An hour
Again,
ago.
no takers. Yeah, because it's really sort of you just do it because you're thinking I'm just telling Patrick about this, you know. But it absolutely is discoverable. And one of the challenges, and it's come up with us more and more, is as part of an educational record, Blackboard, Canvas. Do you have Blackboard or Canvas, sir? Blackboard. You know, so when you have those class discussion boards, how long does that last? Is that an educational record? You know, so we've had faculty begin asking, how long do I have to keep the papers on, you know, and Dropbox and all those kinds of things? And so I think this idea of technology living forever, you know, we haven't thought about as much as perhaps we should.
Right. So we've been talking a lot about some of these types of students that Tom introduced, where you have your disruptive students or your litigious students or your narcissistic students, and trying to give you general tips on how to navigate those and what are the playbook when this comes up. But we want to spend the next part here sort of talking about when the rules might change, okay? And that's when we're talking about at what point do we move into we're concerned that this might be a dangerous student, and how do we respond in those kind of situations? So you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that is the situation that most of us fear. And obviously, you know, we have some of the more highly, I guess, discussed issues over the past few years. Terrible tragedies that arouse. And, you know, we get really concerned. And I'll tell you, I do hear, it's not unusual for a faculty member to call me and go, I have this guy in class, and I don't want another Virginia Tech. I hear those words, actually. And it's because there's something about this guy that's raising alarms, and absolutely understandable. And you know, it's very frustrating. So we see this as one of the great challenges for faculty. So I got some quotes which I thought were kind of interesting. We've all had at least one student in class who just didn't seem right, but couldn't quite put our finger on it. Anyone been there? Right, a few hands, a few nods, okay. The second one. From Peter Lake. Some of you may know Peter Lake. He's actually a faculty member at Stetson Law in Florida. Colleges are very accustomed to accommodating learning and physical disabilities, but they don't understand simple ways of accommodating mental health disabilities. So I've got this student in class I'm really worried about. Why don't I just tell him to leave? It's pretty simple, isn't it? But can you do that? And a former colleague of mine, Adam Malloy, who's now down at ACE, basically saying it's gray. So this is the world of depends that we live in. That it isn't so obvious, well, just do this or just do that. There's so many circumstances that have to be taken into consideration. When we have a situation like this, we just don't know, but we're worried.
And what's scary about this is that when we get into the area of dangerous students, no two situations are the same. It's not like, oh, you know, here's a, you know, I've had another student with a vision impairment, I can apply this accommodation, right? I mean, there are some things that are predictable. Like in these kind of situations, no two, you know, when you have a dangerous student or a student you think is dangerous, the circumstances are never the same, which means that your playbook is never the same. You really do have to sort of figure out what are the circumstances and what do we do. And the stakes are always higher. You know, this isn't a student that's a little disruptive that I can try to talk to and calm them down and we can get through the 15 weeks. There's a much more of a tense urgency when you have, you know, this at hand. So,
yeah. So I thought this quote by the president of GW really summed it up. You know, again, all we want to do is the right thing. But what is it? More or less. And that is really what we think is the heart of the conundrum, the heart of the matter, if you will.
And where we've seen campus tragedies, you know, at each of those schools, you had a lot of people that were all trying to do the right thing, and a tragedy still happened, and then it's scrutinized afterwards of what went wrong. So it's a scary sort of thing that even if you think you have the best procedures in place and everyone's got the best of intentions and you try to be right on top of these things all the time, it's not always going to prevent a tragedy. And then when the tragedy happens, it's not, then the institution's going to be scrutinized. But, well, you could have done this or you should have done that.
But, you know, so do you have a concerning student? Do you have a withdrawn student? Do you have a volatile student? Or do you have a dangerous student? How do you know? So when we're responding, we have to try to balance these four things. And so I know there's folks from legal counsel in the room. These are the things you're always trying to balance. One is the concern for the rights of the student. Craig's going to talk about some of that under regulatory law, what we have to offer these students on policies. The second one is I'm worried about the student. So I'm concerned about that. The third thing we're trying to balance is how about others? Whose interest, how do I prioritize that? Do I worry about Johnny or do I worry about the other 10 students Johnny's impacting? Who wins that? How do I balance that? And again, when it reaches the point where the educational process is being disrupted, what is that point? When students are walking in going, I'm not going to come to class anymore if so-and-so is still in the course. And I've heard that. So, again, these are the 4 considerations. Every one of these cases has this is a balancing act between these 4. And I'm sure there's others, but these are, I think, the big 4 that we work with.
So we wanted to just talk about when we go back to, let me just quickly go back with these considerations. You're never going to have a perfect scenario where you can absolutely, completely satisfy all of these considerations. You have to weigh them because there's going to be times where you might say, listen, I need to sort of defer a little bit on the rights of the students at this point because I'm concerned more so about the well-being of others. And you always have to balance them. You'll never have a perfect balance, based on what the circumstances are. But as it relates to, let's start about, the rights of the students, and we wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the external legal doctrines that exist that, are meant, that are good laws that are meant to protect students. And these are things that we should always be considering. So, students have grown up with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm sure, are you all familiar with the general premise of this law, right? That this has been around for a while now. I think we're almost 25 years, 1990, right? And when the ADA came out, it said that students should be, protected from discrimination and harassment based on a disability. So this is one law that I'm just in the next slide going to talk about. And then I'm going to mention briefly HIPAA. These are the 2 laws that we want, and FERPA is in here too. But we didn't want to spend a lot of time on FERPA. But do just a little bit of overview on the ADA in Section 504 relating to education, right? So this was the law, and it doesn't just apply to education, obviously. It applies to employment, which is the world that I work in mostly, or public accommodations. It's saying that if you have, in the educational context, a student with a disability, and but they're otherwise qualified to be here. They meet all of the intellectual and academic standards. But for their disability, they are qualified. They can't be discriminated against, and they can't be harassed about their disability or disadvantaged, or prohibited from participating. Today, most psychiatric conditions, mental health conditions, emotional conditions are covered under the ADA. When the ADA first was written and drafted in 1990, it was limited. Right? And there were actually a lot of people, employees or students or whatever, that had legitimate health conditions, but they weren't protected under the ADA because it was narrow. You had to be defined with a specific disability, otherwise, you weren't protected. They amended the ADA in 2008 and expanded it. So now pretty much any health condition can fall within the scope of the ADA. The standard now is not any sort of specific disability or diagnosis. It's any condition that would affect one or more life activities. That's actually the standard, right? So if I have difficulty concentrating, or walking or breathing, or controlling my emotions or something like that, these are things that now fall within the scope of the ADA. So things like ADHD now would fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And you think, well, no. Last week I met with a student who has quite frequent outbursts and explained, I have a mental health issue, and when I have outbursts, that's just the way it is. And other people just have to understand.
Right. And so what the laws do is they sort of regulate what we can do and not do with a student with a disability, because we don't want to be discriminating against a student with a disability, but we also have a school to run, and we have other students to educate, and we have other sort of needs. And so that's what that did. So what the ADA has always imposed is to say that, if there is a student who's qualified and capable of being there and they have a disability, but they need some sort of adjustment, some sort of accommodation, right? Not to give them an extra advantage, not to give them, some advantage over the, but really just to level the playing field. If there's something that we can do to help that student be successful, then, and that's a reasonable request, right? Remember, and this is going to be the key word on this, reasonable. If it's a reasonable request, then we have to do that. We have to do that in employment for employees, and we have to do that with students. So, I'm sure a lot of you have had situations where, and I understand I was talking with Patrick earlier, that you do have a coordinator here that coordinates requests for accommodations from students with disabilities, right? So some of you may have gotten this, where you have a student that may have a learning disability, and what will help level the playing field is to help them, they get maybe extra time on a test, right? Again, it's not to give them an extra advantage, but it's able to accommodate them so that they can be successful. That's a simple academic accommodation, right? Or sometimes private testing areas. In the housing world with students, sometimes students need special housing accommodations. I have a medical condition, asthma, or a respiratory condition. I need an air-conditioned room, or a non-air-conditioned room, or a carpeted room, or not a carpeted room. I mean, there's all these sort of like reasonable accommodations, right? Most of these seem pretty boilerplate, right? Oh, well, this person has this condition, and it's an interactive process, but you have certain standard academic accommodations that seem to be successful. It gets more complicated, though, when we start talking about mental or emotional conditions, right? Because what if I have bipolar disorder, right? And because of my disability, I have outbursts. I stand up and scream, or I get very angry. I have very volatile emotions. How do you accommodate that? Does that mean that under the AD we have to accommodate that in a classroom, right? And we don't. That's where the word reasonable come in. It wouldn't be reasonable to say, well, we understand that you have a disability, therefore, just for you, we're going to allow you to have outbursts in class. No one else can, but you can so that's not what the law is meant to do, right? The law also adds a very key component, right, which is something that they've it's evolved over the years, but is the direct threat standard, right? And what it says is that if you have a student who, and this is the language here, poses an imminent risk of danger, right? There's a direct threat to the health and safety of either the student, that they're threatening to be a harm to themselves or a harm to other people or something like that. Nothing prohibits you from acting in that situation, right? We would rather have the institution act, address the imminent threat, and then we can figure out later what accommodations need to be in place, right? So this is where we have things in disciplinary codes like interim suspensions. Most of the time if a student's going to get thrown out of school or be disciplined or suspended, they're entitled to due process, right? They get a hearing, they get a chance to defend their position. If we have a situation where there's a direct threat, even if the student has an emotional or psychological disability, we have these things in here where we can take immediate action to protect that student or others because we've determined them to be an imminent threat.
And the Office of Civil Rights has sent out a series of letters over the years saying if a student is a danger to themselves or others, you can separate them from the institution and have some level of immunity to challenges of unfair treatment. However,
so it was recently changed in March where they've said the new standard is a federal disability law does not require a public entity to permit an individual to participate in or benefit from the services or programs and activities of that entity when that individual poses a direct threat to the health and safety of others.
so what's missing? Yeah. Themselves. The Department of Justice, and the language was revised, that's removed danger to self as something that essentially, if you take action based on reasonable danger or threats to others, if you were to take steps to remove that student from the institution, you in fact would be a defense to accusations of unfair treatment. But they removed to other or to self, which has left a lot of colleges and universities trying to figure out, so that means if a student is a danger to themselves, can we act? And I want to, yeah, what I'd like you to do, and unfortunately, one of the great challenges was in 2013 at Western Michigan University. A young man was overtly suicidal. He was suicidal. Anybody know this case? Western Michigan University, fall of 2013, so about a year ago. He was overtly telling everyone, I'm going to harm myself, I'm going to kill myself, I don't want to go on, blah, blah, blah. Now, naturally, his friends, that's alarming. Who wants to be with the person in your study group saying, I'm going to kill myself? Or your roommate in the residence hall, always, I don't want to go on living, so forth and so on. So the university stepped in and said, really, we can't have this. And they withdrew him. and he filed a challenge with the Office of Civil Rights, and the Office of Civil Rights weighed in and said, yeah, you can't do that. You can't discriminate against a student on the basis of, danger to self, at least as, as an actionable thing. You must accommodate and so forth and so on. And you hadn't successfully tried to accommodate. So he was allowed to return to campus, and I think it was 6 weeks later he killed himself on campus. So whose interests were served? But that is the state of the direct threat standard right now.
So this poses a new challenge because, what if we do get a student and somehow, it comes to you through, you can imagine the way that these things would come up. I'm writing a paper that's very disturbing that I'm talking about causing harm to myself, what it would be like to die. I think about dying all the time, and you're getting this on a paper. Is that scholarly inquiry, creative expression, or is it something that I need to be worried that this person's a threat to themselves? And then even now, even threat to themselves, we're limited in what we can do. If they were saying, I really wonder what it would like to be causing harm to mass numbers of people and something like that, we probably have a little more legal leeway to say we're going to jump on top of that, right? We have to play it a little broader if they're talking about threats to themselves. So this is yours, Tom.
Well, assumptions. So the question is
on the ADA here.
Right. So on what basis can we act? Well, I get a lot of calls again like, well, I just, I assume that this is the case. Well, the truth of the matter is you can't take an action to remove a student who you think is dangerous because you assume they're dangerous. Assumptions are not actionable. Predictions. I have heard this. I know he's a ticking time bomb. And I'll always say, give me the date and the time it's going to happen. Let me know. And of course, they can't do it. But we all have identified, and that's the word I've heard a lot, ticking time bomb. We can't do that. What we have to do is have assessments. We have to have objective assessments of a person's mental health condition by a qualified professional. So predictions and assumptions are not really something we can act on. Assessment is.
So the one thing we just want to mention real briefly on these external legal factors is HIPAA, which is relates to the privacy of a student's medical records, right? Because this governs healthcare that says that if I talk to my doctor and those records, those are confidential, people shouldn't be able to have access to them. It's a great law. It's a good law. It comes into the college and university setting where if a student does come to your center, I don't know the exact title, the Center for Students with Disabilities or the office that coordinates these accommodations, right? If I'm a student and I go to that office and say I need an accommodation, I have ADHD, and these are the accommodations I need, and they work it out, and there's an interactive process. And when you get it, you probably just get, this is what the accommodation is that they need. You don't get all of the information about, it's because the student has ADHD, or because the student has this condition, they need this. That information, and that's because that kind of information is protected under HIPAA. Same thing in working with counseling centers, right? Is that if a student is working with a counselor, right, you can refer a student to counselor saying, I'm concerned about this student. The student has put disturbing illustrations in their coursework. I would like them to see a counselor. And the counselor's probably going to say, okay, I will talk to the student, thank you. Okay? Please keep me posted on if there are other issues. But you're not going to get a lot back. They're not going to be able to loop back to you and say, well, I talked to them and this is what they said. Or, they may be able to give you some reassurances of, we've done an assessment and we've determined that the student is not a threat. And you may be frustrated by that because you may say, well, what do you mean? I'm living this every day. I see these things. They're not going to be able to give you much. It doesn't mean that you should not be collaborating with them, but understand that because of HIPAA and because we want to protect the students' confidentiality as it relates to counseling sessions and their health records, it's going to be a one-way street to some extent, is that you're going to be sharing information with the counselors. They're not going to be able to give you a lot of feedback back, and that's okay. That's how it's supposed to work.
And in fact, you don't want it. 2005, MIT, Elizabeth Shin. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Elizabeth had a challenge, a lot of problems, and they had meetings. And the therapists went in and actually had meetings with administrators, deans, faculty. They talked about her. And they shared information, said, this is what's going on. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. It was a horrific story. It ended up ultimately in her death. And the family sued and said, well, you didn't take adequate care. Well, of course, to the professionals that were treating her, they have a professional obligation as licensed mental health professionals and physicians to have done something. But then the Massachusetts court said something that scared higher education. They said once those therapists breached that, and they brought the administrators in and they gave them confidential information, that duty went to those administrators and faculty. And so the family filed a suit, and the lawsuit was allowed to go on against certain individual administrators. Scared the whatever out of higher ed. The family eventually settled it out of court, but that is still a doctrine that's out there that if that gets breached and you're part of the treatment team, if you will, this is where behavioral intervention teams have to be terribly careful. Because if you start swapping information with people outside of the mental health, treatment community, you might in fact not only violate HIPAA, but you could be taking on a liability. So if you're faced with this, there's several considerations we want. One is fear. When you hear someone is bipolar, you hear someone is borderline, you immediately conjure up thoughts of the media, those pictures I showed you before. We know that it's just a matter of weeks before they're going to do this. Well, the truth of the matter is, just because someone is mentally ill, they are 4 times more likely to be a victim than to do anything. And yet, that's a myth that is out there. So when you hear a student in your class is this or that, I know it's so easy to start thinking, oh, they're probably going to go off. They're not. The chances of that happening really is quite slim. What is actionable, then? Well, these are some things that are not. I hear this probably 3 times a week. And I have to say, running into your ex in the supermarket, that's uncomfortable, but not necessarily unsafe. Running into that roommate it didn't work out with, that's uncomfortable, but not unsafe. And we have a lot of students who tell us, if someone says something to me and I don't like it, that makes me feel unsafe. I have to work that through probably 2 or 3 times a week. Fear, because we're afraid of someone, we can't take action. I have people call me and go, everybody in class is afraid of them. You have to do something. And I have to say, I can't I charge you with others being afraid of you. I can't do that. And you cannot action odd, thank God. You cannot action weird, odd, strange, because, well, none of you out there would, but think about that. If everybody you looked at, you went, that person's weird. You can't do that. There are 3 things that you can action.
So the first one is, what is their behavior, right? What are they doing? Like Tom said, students are odd. They're supposed to be odd. They're students, and so this is, there are certain characteristics or things that they're saying are going to be off, but what are they, you always want to focus on what are they actually doing? What is behavior?
And the second thing you can take action with respect to is?
Their behavior. Again, what is it that they're doing when you want to communicate that to the community, your student conduct officer, to the dean, what you want to be able to describe? This is the behavior that they're engaging in.
And in case there's any doubt,
it's their behavior. This is what we need to focus on all the time, and that's the thing that you're going to need to articulate, is that these are the particular things, because then we're going to look at that behavior, and then we're going to weigh it against something else, right?
This is a conversation we have all the time with faculty, with not just faculty, but we have to take, I'm afraid, I'm fearful, I'm uncomfortable, they're weird, I'm unsafe, down to, you've got to give me something they did that violates a policy. Because again, I can't come in and charge them with being weird. So again, types of action that is actionable. Now, I can't define any of these. Maybe Craig can, he's the attorney. A single act by virtue of its intensity. All right, so I figure if I say I'm going to kill you or something, that's pretty intense, single act. You'll be sorry. Did I just threaten you or not? Maybe? Not sure, yeah. But we hear that a lot. You'll get yours. A lot of that. But a pattern of behavior. Obviously, if a person's engaging in a pattern of threatening, challenging kind of behavior, that may be actionable. And can you define reasonable behavior that a reasonable person would conclude disrupts the process of teaching and learning?
Reasonable is the favorite word of lawyers. I'll tell you that. I mean, we know this is sort of like trying to find what kind of standard, right? But these are put in to be able to say that you need to be able to accommodate is that people have different temperaments, right? People have different reactions to things, right? And you can't make your decisions about action based on the perception of the recipient, right? So, because there's some people that are very sensitive. I know some people that, you could say boo to them and they're going to run scared and like think I'm being threatened, my life is in jeopardy. And then there's other people that you could yell and scream at and they have real thick skins and you'd think, oh my gosh, how can you sit there and take that, right? And you have those sort of extremities, and you can't make your decisions based on the subjective feelings of the person that's, experienced behavior. You have to have some sort of middle ground, and you need to have somebody. And quite frankly, the person that's receiving it isn't always the most objective person, right? If a student is yelling and screaming at you and being challenging and threatening you, not physically or dangerous, but you have an emotional reaction to that. You may not be the most objective person to be able to weigh. You do need to run that by somebody else to look at and say, okay, let me look at from this sort of an objective outsider. I don't have the emotions attached to this. You're right, I haven't been there. But objectively and looking at this reasonably, I can't see that this violates a rule.
One more of my wacky true stories. 2 students in a class. Both were actually returning students. Both were, I don't know, in their 30s or 40s. 2 women. One said the other's looking at me weird, and when they hand things out in class, she won't pass them on to me. I want her out of the class. You're not doing it? I can't even get a depends from you? But she's looking at me weird. She's glaring at me. I want her out. And that person really, I'm telling you, she would walk, I really feel scared. And I don't doubt that, but I can't kick someone out because someone is staring at you. Accommodations.
Right. So we do have, as I was mentioning earlier, that if the student does disclose to the institution that I have a health condition or I have a mental condition or an emotional condition, under the ADA, as we've talked about, we would have the obligation to try to see what can we do to accommodate this and what would be reasonable, right? And the magic words on this is that what the law really requires is something that's called an interactive process, right? It's I work in the employment arena, but it's like you say, okay, well, what is the condition, right? And the institute give us, if we need medical documentation to confirm that, we will get that. And then we need to figure out what's a reasonable accommodation that would allow you to be successful, but still allows the institution to meet its goals, right? And not be disruptive to other people's experience. So every accommodation could be different, but remember the magic word is that it does need to be reasonable. We don't have to, like I said, allow students, a bipolar student, you're allowed to disrupt class, right? Maybe there's things that we do with attendance, maybe there's things we do with sort of accommodations otherwise academically, but remember that it always at the end of the day does have to be reasonable, and you have others that sort of will negotiate that. The other thing about accommodations is that it's not the student's preferred accommodation. The student doesn't always get exactly what they want. The law does not require that. If I say, I suffer from severe depression, that would fall under the scope of the ADA. So I want to be able to miss class whenever I'm feeling depressed, without warning, right? That's not something, and that's what I prefer, just to be able to kind of like wing it, like not wing it. I mean, I don't want to minimize that and say that, but when I'm experiencing depression, I just want to be able to not show up to class. That doesn't work for us, right? It doesn't work for you as a faculty member. So maybe we work with the doctors to try to estimate, well, what is a reasonable amount of time that we expect this would happen? Can we say that with a minimum amount of notice you're allowed to miss this many number of classes? That's the kind of stuff that we would have to work out. It's not always exactly what the student demands. The student may think that. I demand this, and I'm entitled to it because I have a disability, and that's not how the law works. The law works where it's an interactive process where we find a reasonable accommodation that will help the student be successful, but also allow us to continue the educational mission and not disrupt other people's experience. So,
counseling.
Yep.
Anybody here a psychology professor or counseling professor? Okay, good. Okay, so you know this to be true, right? 15 minutes, you can pretty much cure anyone, right? Yeah. See, it's pretty easy. Send them to the counseling center. Done.
Give them a shot, and they can come back to class.
Well, it doesn't work that way. Counseling isn't a panacea. It doesn't mean I'm going to ask you to do the counseling so everything is going to be better. I mean, clearly, as someone who teaches in the field, I think it's valuable. I think it's helpful. I think it's a wonderful thing. But I want to distinguish between, evaluations, counseling, and voluntary. An evaluation, and that's allowed. We can say we believe that you've exhibited behavior that does reasonably give rise to concerns about, your potential safety issues. So with that said, we can ask for an evaluation, but we always do it on a behavior ground. You did this, therefore, we need to know that you're not a danger to someone. And we can have an evaluation where that person can actually meet with a professional. They can let us know. They're not going to call us back and say, well, then we talked about his mom and then his dad. They're going to say essentially whether or not that person presents as a danger to themselves or others. And they can, but the challenge is, and help me out with this one, when you see someone on a Thursday afternoon and you decide they're not a danger to themselves or others, how long is that good for? Yeah, but I mean, the point being they could go out the next day and do something. And I think a lot of us think that, well, if a therapist says they're not a danger, good for life. And it's not. And what our therapists actually say is good for about 15 minutes. And I mean, not quite that bad, but I mean, you do your best. It's what the person tells you to work with. So it's one of the challenges of saying, well, how long does that last? Mandatory counseling. And again, I pick on you, forgive me, but to have someone sentenced to counseling is not always the most productive way of starting a counseling relationship. I know some therapists who can work with that and they can handle it because they can come in, the student's angry, and they can kind of work with that. But, typically, by the way, there's a few court cases that say, conduct, panels, whether that's at the academic or other level, can't make, in other words, it's just inappropriate for them to go, you need 3 sessions of dialectical behavioral therapy. Based on what? You're a history major. So, counseling interventions are left best to the professionals. Mandatory counseling, again, not something we're all a fan of. Voluntary counseling, one of the things we really urge you to do is, again, we said partner with the counseling center. If you have a student you're really worried about, oftentimes someone will come out, help you, work with you, and oftentimes you'd be amazed how many students you can talk into the counseling center. You can partner, and I think that's something we don't always remember to do. It's such an important thing. Leaves and withdrawals.
Go and take it.
All right, so same thing. A voluntary leave is just that a student says, you know what, that's a good idea. I think I need to take some time off. And for a lot of our students, not a bad idea to take some time off from school, to sort some things out. One of the things I often say to students is, you're doing okay, you're making it. But if you were able to resolve whatever the issues are that are kind of bugging you now, think how much better you'd do. And a lot of students understand that, and they will take a leave. But then we get into I'm going to make you take a leave. Colleges used to do that a lot. Well, those days they're still there, but you have to be very careful. So every institution must have an involuntary leave or withdrawal policy, where it must be in writing, what that is, when it can be invoked. There must be an appeal process. There must be a chance for the student to protest or to say, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. This has been tested out in a number of court cases. So essentially, it's got to be based on a legitimate assessment by a qualified professional, again, with the student having an opportunity to counter. And then you get into dueling professionals. Well, our therapist says, needs to take a leave, and his cousin, the doctor, says, no, he doesn't. And you'll never get around that quandary a little bit. But so if you have a leave policy, you can have an involuntary leave policy, but make sure it's in writing, make sure you have the standards and the appeal is there, and that's pretty much established. The student conduct process. We've sort of talked about that throughout. As Craig said, just because you have a mental health issue doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. As I said, I met with a student, it was last week, who said, I shout and scream at people, but I got problems. So everyone needs to understand that. But no, they don't. So having a mental health condition doesn't absolve you. You're still held to the standards of behavior. But again, we've said this, whatever you do, take action based on the behavior, not the mental health. And again, if you don't have a disruptive student policy explaining what is a disruptive behavior, what does the institution consider to be disruptive behavior, really urge you to think about drafting one, because that gives the faculty member a little more leeway to say, this is the standard for disruptive behavior or expectations. There could be, I suppose, an aspirational policy. This is what we expect in classrooms. But if you've got something, then you can say to that student, you did this, and that would seem to violate this disruptive student policy, because that gives you a behavioral basis to act. Not, I think you're weird, not, I think you're strange, not, I think it's uncomfortable. So we urge you to think about doing that.
And I think that this is the cleanest involuntary leave process you can have, right? Is that, sometimes where you have these involuntary medical leaves and all of that, they can be challenged and they've gone under a lot of scrutiny. But if you have a clear, remember what we talked about, this sort of like the building blocks of this, right? It's a very formulatic, mathematical, that you've got specific behavior that you can describe, right? That you can communicate to your conduct people. They look at it and say, yes, this behavior is right. We've got a policy that speaks right to this type of behavior. We will afford due process, and at the end of this, whatever action we need to take, that's a rock solid sort of process about how to respond. And it can be, the idea of a student conduct process is hopefully it's educational, that it's not so ruthless that a student is irreparably harmed. They go through the conduct process. They learn. It's educational, but it also is a good way to be able to, if you have the situation. It's probably the best tool for us to rely on when we get into those areas of dangerous students, is that we have a procedure in place. We've got good policies and good procedures in place about how to respond to this when it comes up.
So with that said, we just want to say thank you. If we've done our job, we've confused you, scared you, made you wonder, what do I do? But I think, that's why Patrick is here. He has every answer. With legal counsel. The two of them got it all. So if you do have a situation, really call early, call often, because I think these things are fraught with legal entanglements, obviously, but what's also best for the student, what's best for others. And, we can't give you the answer. I don't have it. As Craig said, every case is different. So, thanks.
Question, I guess, for Patrick then.
I'm going to give you the mic so that everyone can hear this too. So.
Behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Does that really mean behavior that goes against an established policy?
Mm-hmm. In most situations, absolutely. Now, a mental health evaluation could decide, a licensed professional could decide you are a danger to self or others. Now, kind of let's skip that one little direct threat standard that we told you about. If you are a licensed mental health professional in the state of New York, right, and you diagnose someone as being a danger to self or others, you have a professional obligation to act, tear us off, warn others, possibly duty to protect, hospitalize the person. So these professional codes also kind of bump up against what the ADA standard is.
Right, because with the ADA standard, you were talking about risks to others,
Mm-hmm.
and then you kind of addressed this later, what about perceived risks?
Well, yeah.
And he's glaring at me is a behavior,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not a behavior that violates the policy. So
Yeah.
it's
Right.
not a behavior,
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah, and exactly. Yeah. Didn't I say we'd have no answers? You're my depends person. Yeah,
Well-
and that is the challenge.
Well, and that's where you look at some of those other strategies that we kind of put out there of like, okay, well, what's the behavior? The behavior is glaring, okay? All right, let's look at our rule book. Do we have a rule on glaring? Not really, but it's still problematic. It's still distracting. It's still disruptive. So then we need to think about these other ways, which is, can we go through a counseling? Is it a matter of social skills and having, some adult mentor be able to tell this person, listen, some concerns have been raised about this type of behavior, and trying to help the student that way, right? I mean, sometimes, in most times in those kind of cases, discipline is not the right way to go about it, right? And so we don't want to have policies for every little weird behavior,
It's just if you have to act, you're almost just so much safer to act on the basis of behavior, a policy violation, than, gosh, I think.
There's actually a question in the Westbury. I think
Oh.
we have the mic on.
Oh.
Michael Cavalli has a question. Can you just say his name? Say Michael.
Michael?
And Michael, you had a question, we understand? And I don't know if we can hear you. Oh, there you are.
Okay. My question was actually in regards to the ADA policy that you had cited before, where they dropped the piece on threat to self and just left this threat to others. The policy only refers to public entities. Now, NYIT is a private institution. what is the implication of that policy for us then?
Well, the ADA applies to public and private institutions. So even as a private institution, you're still required to be in compliance with the ADA. And so, as a leader, that it's not going to prevent a student from bringing a discrimination complaint against a private institution.
Okay, thank you.
So we had a question. I'm going to give you this mic so that they can hear you. Okay.
Okay. I was wondering about the behavioral intervention meetings that we have. Are you then suggesting that we should not be having them?
No, not at all. Just be careful what you share. If there's a therapist, a licensed mental health professional, college counseling center at those meetings, they can listen, they can talk in generalities, but I would suggest keeping a bit of a wall there. I mean, you can talk about the student's behavior, not a problem. If you've observed it in the classroom or elsewhere on campus, we just don't want them going, yeah, well, they're borderline, we all know that. Those kinds of things that can easily come out, because we're all friends here. So you have to maintain, again, there's a wall that you have to be very careful to maintain.
I'm going to give you the mic, okay, for them.
We're looking for answers, not questions.
Sorry, my question is, if you could say something more about, you mentioned the Universal Student Database that you've created, and my question, I guess, a couple of questions. Is that limited to academic integrity? You were talking about plagiarism at the time. Or is it discipline? And number two, who has access to the information?
We have a university-wide database for all behavioral concerns. We have one school that's, it's throughout student affairs. We have 12 global campuses. They're all using it. Faculty, not so much. And we're meeting with the deans and encouraging them to do it for this very reason. So Johnny doesn't pull the "you lost my paper" in 5 different classes. I'm still getting over that. That was like in the 80s. But that's one of the challenges, persuading faculty who kind of, I say this as a faculty member, kind of a legacy of being almost an independent contractor. I show up, I teach my classes, and understanding that they're kind of part of this larger system sometimes can be a challenge.
But
You're talking about faculty
inputting, right?
Yes,
Right.
yeah, we would like.
Don't have access to.
Oh no, I'm sorry, no.
Can't look up.
Right.
No. We've given one person in each school, like the assistant dean or something, the ability to look up records. Absolutely, sorry, I forgot that.
Yeah, so the idea of faculty would be able to submit an incident report, but it doesn't mean that we've given them keys to the cabinet to be able to look at a student's entire disciplinary record. And that's important because that's a FERPA issue right there, right? That FERPA
absolutely.
does say that the institutions can share information amongst each other where there's a legitimate educational interest. And so, to that extent, we have a designated student affairs official in each of our colleges to say, well, you have a legitimate interest, but it doesn't mean that everybody who has access to this database to input can also see everything.
And we actually can set ours up that you can only review the reports that you've entered. So there's different levels that, depending on what you want. I don't want 100 people having access. That would just be wrong.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you. We'll meet in the middle. How about that?
If a student attempts suicide on campus or in the residence halls, is it reasonable to have them evaluated before they come back, or can they come back on their own terms?
Well, let's talk to Hunter College. Anybody know that case? If you have a blanket policy, all students who attempt suicide are suspended, you will lose that. And the lawsuits, and Hunter's one of the main ones a few years ago. But it's okay. My suggestion is, if you're going to have a policy that anyone who's treated at a hospital for anything, broken leg, the flu, should be cleared to return, I think you're in help me out here, a much safer position to say, well, bubonic plague, no problem, but if you have suicidal ideations, we need you cleared. I think that would be treating mental health differently. So my guess would be that, so it's nothing wrong with a college can absolutely say, are you ready to return? You just can't have a blanket policy, anybody who does this is out. Several students, Georgetown, Jordan Knott case, it was GW, they lost that one. There's a case at Princeton now, they're probably going to lose, same grounds, like blanket kinds of policies.
Anything else? Okay, well, we're very appreciative of the opportunity to come talk with you.
And thank all of you for helping out and answering. And I put Livy on the spot. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say we have every answer because every case differs, and we may have said some things depending on a case might not be 100%, a little bit different. So, but these are challenging, and we know they're out there. So appreciate it. Thanks, folks.